Samuel, and specifically we'll be looking at 1 Samuel 18 through 20 this morning. 1 Samuel 18 through 23 chapters packed full with all kinds of, interesting things, and we'll see that as it unfolds. This is a section in our study of 1 Samuel that I'm calling it David's favor and Saul's fury, but it's a strange section, not strange in the sense that anything overly bizarre happens, but strange in the sense that what we see here is in like 3 chapters, Saul attempts to kill David like many times. And we're going to see Saul fail to do that and David be delivered. But we're going to find, I guess, some insightful and to some degree entertaining stories about Saul and David. Is it okay to be entertained by, these stories? Well, yeah, it is. But these are stories that they can make TV shows about, right? I mean, these are like... Saul throws a spear at David, and Jonathan, Saul's son, is going to deliver David by shooting a bow and arrow over him in a cryptic code. You know, there's all kinds of interesting things that happen in these sections. But one of the things that we see here is the relationship between fear and anger. Fear and anger. In the story from Saul's perspective, as David gains popularity and approval, Saul becomes more and more afraid of what that means for himself. Because Saul knows that eventually there is going to be, in his mind, a challenger to the throne, because Samuel has already told him, God's going to take this kingdom away from you. And the more popular that David gets, the more afraid that Saul gets. And the more afraid Saul gets, the more he lashes out in rage and in anger. One of the things that we see even in our life today, which is why the Bible continues to speak to us in so many different ways, is the connection between fear and anger, right? Oftentimes people respond with the most rage when they are the most afraid. There's maybe a reason why we think about, you think about things that get people in a rage. Maybe the first thing that comes to my mind is politics. I mean, you just get on Facebook and you can see a lot of angry people, right? But where's that rage coming from? Where's that anger coming from? Well, it's largely coming from fear. Fear about what the future would look like if that group or that party or that person got their way. And I don't want to live in that world. And then all of a sudden, we have expressions of anger. And the same thing is true when it comes to sensitive subjects, other sensitive subjects, including like your children, the way that you raise your children. That's a very sensitive thing, right? You have your beliefs about what it should look like, what it shouldn't look like. And if other people come and say, well, you need to be doing this or need to be doing that, maybe there's defensiveness, or if you go on social media, you can find 1,001 videos that say, if you do this, you're ruining your child, or whatever the case might be. I was talking to Sarah last night or maybe the night before, saying, we hold the little baby and think, wonder what we could know a 3-month-old cares about if we could really ask him, And I was saying, I think probably the thing that they're concerned about is not how you feed them, how they sleep, how they, you go through the whole 9 yards. I think the thing they're going to care about is, do you care? That's the definition of taking care of a baby, I think. And there's better ways, I'm sure, and worse ways of doing it. But the main thing is, do you care? Do you love them? But we get worked up about all kinds of things. Those are just a couple of, sensitive examples. But the more afraid we get, the more we tend to lash out in anger and in rage. So we'll see more of that play out. There's a reason, relatedly to that, there's a reason that the removal of fear is an important theme in Scripture. When we're afraid, we act in ways that are destructive. Oftentimes it's anger, but it can take other forms as well. When we're afraid, we can't experience the peace of God, right? And so peace, this is aside from Samuel, but peace, especially in the Old Testament, and the New Testament's picking up on the same theme, but the word for peace, shalom in Hebrew, it's not the absence of conflict. It's included in that. But peace is everything the way that it should be. So when we think about experiencing the surpassing peace that comes through Christ Jesus, it's calling our hearts to the reality that in Jesus Christ, everything is being put back the way it was supposed to be or the way that it should be. And anger, as a result, is driven out from us. Perfect love, John says, drives out fear. And by extension, if we are people at peace, we relinquish the need to fight, because everything is going to be, in the end, as God has intended it to be for God's people. So, James says in James 1, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. The anger, human anger, does not lead to godly behavior or righteousness. We're also going to see, I'm giving you the application at the beginning, I'll give it to you at the end, but we're also going to see in these 3 chapters, more than just Saul's anger and David's favor, we're also going to see several individuals and groups, specifically Jonathan, Michal, as we'll see her in chapter 18 and 19, and just the common people as well, and there's others that we'll meet throughout the rest of our story, Samuel included. But we're going to see individuals who, because of their faith in God, have a redefinition in their understanding of loyalty. Because of their faith, loyalty changes its meaning. So Jonathan is whose son? Saul's son. You may not remember, but Saul also has a daughter named Michal. She's the daughter of the king. Samuel first anointed who to be the king of Israel? First. Saul, right? So Jonathan, Michal, and Samuel, from a worldly perspective, all should be loyal to whom? Saul. And all 3 of them are going to be loyal to David. Why? Because their faithfulness, their faith in God has led them to redefine the commitment of their loyalty. And faithful friends, faithful to God friends, are friends that have their priorities arranged by God and the priority of their relationships arranged by God. And so we'll see that playing out as well. So let's start with chapter 18, and we'll see this progression of individuals and groups and how it all plays out. I'm going to start by basically just talking about chapter 18, and then we'll get into 19 and 20. So same concept here, favor and fury, approval and fear, it's all related, but David's approval and Saul's fear. Now here, I'm just going to break down a very simple outline here. You could follow along in your Bible. We're not going to spend, inordinate amounts of time on any one section, because it is a lengthy section here that we're putting together. But 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 5. I'm going to read all of these verses here. I'm not going to read everything this morning, but I'm going to read these. As soon as he finished speaking to Saul, time out. Chapter 17, David killed Goliath. And Saul is inquiring, who is this guy? And so that's going on. Whose son are you? I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. As soon as he finished, he's just killed Goliath, talked to Saul. As soon as he finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, gave it to David, his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Why do you think that Jonathan gravitated toward David in this section? He recognized that God was working through David? I think that's fair. What else? Everybody loves a hero. Yeah, this is true. Could it be that, remember, Jonathan has already demonstrated himself, he wouldn't say it this way, but from our perspective, to be a hero. Right? Jonathan is the one who said, hey, we've got 2 swords in this whole camp of 600 people. I'm going to take them and see what I can do. So Jonathan is a person who's already acted in tremendous faith up to this point, to try to do God's work even in spite of his father. Multiple conflicts between Jonathan and Saul up to this point. It could be that Jonathan realizes that David is sort of a kindred spirit to Jonathan, right? I mean, they both have a similar objective. And we'll see that reiterated in chapter 20 at the very end of our section for today. But here's another warrior with similar courageous faith in the God of Israel. I think Jonathan sees David and says to himself, this is exactly the kind of person that I'm trying to be, right? This is the kind of person that I can go to battle with to do the things that God has set out for us to do. And exactly why, we could speculate on, but there's a love that Jonathan has for David that comes from watching what David does in relation to his father. Yes, Goliath, but it's in the conversation with David and Saul that Jonathan says, okay, this is a guy that I want to support and to stand next to. So Jonathan gives David the necessary weaponry to further the battle, right? He gives him his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. He gives him what he needs. And elsewhere in chapter 18, we're going to find that David is a poor man. He doesn't have a lot. And so Jonathan is saying, I'll give you what you need to go and fight these battles because you're the man that we need leading us. So Saul continues to use David for his own ambition, for his own objective. He was wanting to keep him close, really, in verse 2. Keep him close so he can keep an eye on him, but also so that he can use him to win battles and things. Saul uses David because it pleases the masses, but he does it with disdain, right? He doesn't like that he's having to keep David around, as we'll see very quickly. But Jonathan sees David as being a leader with a shared vision, his shared vision toward the future. So the point is, we're thinking about the people that approve of David, and we're thinking about this, I think, from the perspective of Saul. So Jonathan is Saul's son, so the prince of Israel in that sense, he approves of David. Now we get into the next section, and we find that the people of Israel, the masses, they're approving of David. Basically, there's battle, being won, being fought, all of that. And this is verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. Verse 9 says, and Saul eyed David from that day on. He's keeping watch over David because of his success. Notice that Saul cannot have another person be praised above him. Back in chapter 15, when Saul won victory over Agag and all that, what's he doing? He's setting up a monument to himself. Let everybody remember I did this. And now David is getting more credit, and that's a threat to Saul's status and his ego. And again, in verse 10, you can notice the connection between the harmful spirit and Saul's paranoia and insecurity, as we saw last week. It's after he hears the song, Saul is thousands and David is 10,000s, that the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall, but David evaded him twice. The point is, as verse 12 makes clear, Saul was afraid of David. He was afraid. And so he was acting in rage and aggression toward him because of his fear, to the extent that he actually sends him away from his presence at the end of in verse 13. He said, get out of here. We don't want you around anymore. But it's a delicate thing, right? Because he needs to keep him close so he knows how big the threat is, but he needs to keep him far enough away. And there's this tension here. And so we get to verse 17, and this is where we get into our next section. So the people approve of David, Jonathan approves of David, and now Saul's daughter, Michal, is going to approve of David. So not only Saul's son, but Saul's now daughter. So Saul has this plan in verse 17. I'm going to summarize some of this, but he says to David that he's going to give his daughter Merib to David, but then he doesn't. But in verse 20, here's what we find. Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they, Saul's servants, told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Why is he happy that his daughter loves David? Does anybody, if you're familiar with the story, you may already know, but
she liked the success too. I think she liked the success too, because she was sort of seemed like a highfalutin, because he embarrassed her later.
yeah, sure, true. She loves David, and Saul doesn't like when David is loved and approved because it's threatening to him. But Saul likes that his daughter likes David, if you followed that. Now, why? Because Saul is fixing to try. I've lived in Georgia long enough to say that, right? Fixing to try. He's about to try to use his daughter's love to kill David. This is verse 21. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. But Saul knew something about David, and he knew he had no money. And in their time, there was a bride price to be paid and all of that. And Saul's he's playing chess, right? So he said, I already know what he's going to say. Verse 23, and Saul's servant spoke those words in the ears of David. And David says, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law? I am a poor man. I have no reputation. He's saying, I have nothing to give. And the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. And Saul said, thus you shall say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. In other words, Saul tells David, just kill 100 Philistines, and that'll be payment enough. 1 versus 100, right? Saul's like, he's a good fighter, I'll give him a 5% chance of making it out of this alive. I like those odds. There's an irony and there's an intentional play on words in verse 26. When his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. And commentators have pointed this out. It pleased Saul to use his daughter to try to kill David, and it pleased David to use this opportunity to become son-in-law to the king. And David goes out, and in verse 27, he rose and along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And he brought their foreskins, which were given in full number, to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. Strange story, obviously, much different culture and times. But the point is that David is not only capable of fighting off 100, but 200. And this opportunity that Saul thought was going to be for David's downfall turns out to be to David's continued praise. I'm going to put this on the slide here just for a second. This is Kyle McCarter in a commentary on 1 Samuel, but I think what he says is so true. He says, everything Saul does to thwart David's rise works ironically to David's advantage. Every opportunity Saul attempts to seize for himself turns in the end into an opportunity for David. So this is one of those classic stories where every time the character tries to do something to stop his destiny from coming true, he makes it happen. God has already made the prediction, the prophecy, the kingdom's going to fall from you, and Saul says, no, it's not. And everything Saul does is the reason why it ends up falling away from him, right? And so God is capable of working in human history to his end in very ironic ways at times. So the conclusion of the section, though, is this in verse 28 and 29. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. It's interesting to me here that it says that Saul was David's enemy continually. In other words, Saul was bringing himself at odds with David continually. It doesn't say that David was Saul's enemy continually, right? This is a one-way street. David is not out to get Saul. David is just out to do what is set before him faithfully, right? Whether it be leading in this battle or that battle or that battle. You want me to get 100 of them, I'll get 200 of them, you know? But Saul is set out against David perpetually, and we'll see that in the next section big time. So, point of all of this up to this point is the more approval David gets, the more afraid Saul gets, and that fear is going to spill over into, well, it already has with the spear and whatnot, but it's going to spill over into more and more rage on the part of Saul. And as we've seen, and as we talked about earlier, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. That's what we see in this section. So, 2 chapters. No way we're going to be able to read every line in them, but there's basically 4, they're not separate scenes per se, but there's 4 sequences where we're going to see the loyalty of people close to David, well, really people close to Saul to David, and then Saul's subsequent rage because of that. The first way that David is delivered is Jonathan tries to mediate peace between Saul and David. Saul, in chapter 19, verse 1, explicitly asks his closest advisors, his son and his servants, to kill David. He's saying, this guy is an existential threat to the family, you know? Kill him. That's what we got to do. And Jonathan says, whoa. What's going on here? He says, what sin has he done against you? His deeds, this is in verse 4, his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand and he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. He's saying, what has happened here, Dad, that is causing you to act in this outlandish, irrational way? As a result, in verse 7, it looks like there's going to be a long-term peace, but it's temporary. Saul listened to his voice, and he said, I'm not going to kill him. And Jonathan called David and brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. Okay, so they're Jonathan standing in the middle, and he's saying, okay, you love Israel, let's work together, everybody's happy now. There's a problem. The problem is there's going to be another war, another battle. And in the battle, who do you think the best performer is in the battle? It's David again, right? And as a result, Saul becomes outraged yet again. The harmful spirit from the Lord, every time you find this discussion of this harmful spirit or gloomy spirit or evil spirit, depending on your translation, it's always connected to Saul's fear of David, his paranoia concerning the future. A harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the lyre. Saul sought to pin David to the wall. This is happening again, right? But he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So Jonathan attempts to mediate peace. It doesn't go well, but the point is, from Saul's perspective, Jonathan cannot be trusted. He didn't go along with this, right? Point of application, sidebar. If we only surround ourselves with people that agree with us, we're going to end up leaving Jonathan in the other room, right? The guy who is able to actually see clearly the picture that's in front of him in this particular case. We have loved echo chambers from the beginning, right? So it's not a surprise. But this is what's happening with Saul. He's going to cut Jonathan off from communication from here on out regarding David. In chapter 19, verse 8, Michal, Saul's daughter, saves David. I will not read this whole section to you, but let me just put it this way. Servants of Saul, spies, go and they're watching David's house. David's married to Michal at this point, right? So they're watching their house. They're waiting. In the morning, David's going to come out. Boom, we're going to kill him. I'm not exactly sure how Michal knows about the plot, but people talk, and so she overhears something or someone tells her something. And she tells David, get out of here. You need to leave right now, tonight. Just go the other way. And so he does. She takes an idol or an image, and there's no explanation given to what that means in this passage. But she takes some large statue or idol or something, puts it in the bed, covers it with like goat hair, some blanket or something, and pillow, and the messengers come, and she's like, hey, you can see in there, he's not feeling well. He's very sick. It's like, this is what kids do to convince their parents they're sick. They're like, I'm not feeling well, Mom, don't come in here. The pillows, stuff to look like a person or something. But it works. Well, it doesn't really work, but it works for the purpose of David escapes. So she's like, hey, he's in here, he's sick. So eventually they find out that's not true, obviously. And Saul is outraged at his daughter because of what has transpired. And he said to Michal, this is verse 17, why have you deceived me thus and let my enemy go so that he has escaped? And she answered Saul, she lies to him. She says, he said to me, let me go, why should I kill you? And what are you going to say to that, Saul? So she gets David out of the situation in that way. So from Saul's perspective, my son has tried to save David from my hand. My daughter has tried to save David from my hand. And now in verses 18 through 24, this story is crazy to me in a very interesting way. Samuel delivers David from Saul's hand. So David goes from there. He's like running out in the night. He goes down in verse 18 to Ramah, which is where Samuel was living. Naioth is the little sub area. And Saul finds out that David is down there with Samuel. And Saul sends messengers down there. They call them messengers. He's trying to kill him, so I don't know what the message is, but the message is a knife or something. But he's sending these people down there. And this is what happens in verse 20. Saul sent messengers to take David, and when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they also prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah, and came to the great well that is in Secu. And he answered, Where are Samuel and David? And one said, Behold, they are at Naioth in Ramah. And he went there to Naioth in Ramah. And the Spirit of God came upon him also. And as he went, he prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, Is Saul also among the prophets? In essence, Samuel, this is like almost like the Avengers or something, but Samuel has like a Holy Spirit force field around him and around David. Anybody that's coming close is like they're just immediately prophesying and losing their ability to do what they have set out to do. And Saul himself comes and he tries to go get David, and he's left naked all day and night, prophesying without really control of himself. And there's a great irony because it ends by saying, Thus it is said, Is Saul also among the prophets? That's the second time we've encountered that. The first time was when Saul was anointed as king, and Samuel said, You're going to prophesy. And he started prophesying. Saul is among the prophets, and now it's like, okay, there's another part of that story that explains the phrase. Saul is also among the prophets, ? Trying to kill the true anointed one. Yeah, Mary. I have no idea. What is it? What does it look? Yeah. Well, in their case, they are involuntarily prophesying, right? We don't know the message, right? So it's hard to say, but I would not, if I was speculating, I would say there's a high degree well, I shouldn't say that. There's a degree of probability that Saul is prophesying about his own future. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Exactly, yeah. Exactly. And eventually he falls down and is crying out in whatever that looks like, prophesying in this way. He's lost his clothes in the process, right? And so yeah, I don't know exactly what it looks like. I know that it is not something Saul was enjoying, I don't think. Well, God is speaking something through him to whomever is listening, maybe just to Saul. Yeah. Yeah. And you're keying in on what is exactly the point of these two contrasting stories, right? The first time he prophesies is because God is with him. The second time he prophesies is because God's against him. And Mary, I don't know the content or what it looked like exactly, but my guess is that Saul is conducting his life saying the prophecy of Samuel is not going to come true. I'm going to remain king. And he's going down there to prove it. And God said, not only are you not going to remain king, you're going to say so, something to that effect. But I don't know, to be honest with you. No one knows exactly what he was saying or how that looked. So so these are interesting stories, right? Especially the third one there is like a spiritual force field, as we might think. And then finally, and we're not going to have time to read this whole chapter, I'll just make a couple brief highlights, but Jonathan, he tries to save David here. He really does save David in chapter 20. Long story short, David comes to Jonathan and is like, hey, my friend, your dad's been trying to kill me. I thought you said we were good. What's going on? And Jonathan's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And David said, well, I can read between the lines. Your dad doesn't trust you anymore because you've tried to deliver me. So they talk, and basically Jonathan vows to David that he's going to work for his protection, and he's going to try to discern Saul's intentions and warn David. This is verse 12 through 17, really. But he says to him in verse 16, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. Saul would be probably included in that. Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So Jonathan makes a covenant with David, and Jonathan basically constructs a scenario where he can pass a message to David to let David know that everything is okay. David, you go hide out in the field. I'm going to talk to my dad. If he is very, very angry that you keep not coming to dinner because they're having a feast, if you don't come to dinner first night, second night, third night, and he starts asking me and he's getting angrier and angrier and angrier, I'll know he's trying to do something, and I will go out there with a runner, basically, to go get my arrows, and I will shoot my arrows out there, and I'll send the runner out there, and I'll say, it's further out there, keep going, way back, and you'll know that you need to get out of here. Or if I tell them, oh, it's over here, well, then you'll know that it's safe for you right now. So that's what they do. Sure enough, he shoots it over him, and he eventually sends the arrow fetcher servant boy away, and it's just David and Jonathan left. And then chapter 20, starting in verse 40, Jonathan gave his weapons to his boy and said to him, go and carry them to the city. And as soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap, and he fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, because we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, between my offspring and your offspring forever. And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. They're having to go their separate ways, right? In essence, Jonathan's telling David, you got to get out of here and don't come back. It's not safe. And both Jonathan and David are making clear to each other that our physical distance is not an indication of a waning commitment to faithfulness in God and faithfulness to each other, or to God and to each other. So they embrace as brothers and friends and depart from one another in the fellowship of the Lord. And I love how he says it. He says, the Lord shall be between me and you, between my offspring and your offspring forever. David and Jonathan had a relationship that was not characterized just by common interests or passions or hobbies or any of those kinds of things, but was ultimately a relationship that was bound together by a commitment to the Lord, which is hopefully the basis of our closest relationships as well. These are the takeaways that I think we've established here, and we'll just reiterate for today. Fear is often the fuel for fury. Now there's a practical application of this where we can realize that sometimes when people are lashing out in anger, what we need to be asking ourselves is, what are they afraid of? Because we might be able to help them more if we understand their fear that's leading to their anger, rather than just seeing their anger as the sickness. Their anger is oftentimes more of a symptom than it is the true sickness. So fear is often the fuel for wrath. As we've said, faithfulness to God redefines loyalty. It reorders the priority of our relationships. Jesus' ministry emphasizes that throughout. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? The ones who do the will of my Father. The ones who are listening to me and following me. Let the dead bury their own dead. Follow me. Whoever comes after me must hate his mother and father and brothers. In other words, the number one priority in your life must be me, and secondarily, the mission that I have given to you. So faithfulness to God redefines our loyalty. And then lastly, God's deliverance comes in unusual ways. I mean, you just read these 3 chapters and you're like, well, God was looking out for David, but in some unusual scenarios, unusual ways. Well, I'm thinking about the resurrection of Jesus today, but I'm thinking about the crucifixion of Jesus today. I think it would be fair to say that God's deliverance of the world has come in an unusual way. A way where understanding the plan was not always possible looking forward, but looking back, we can see the mystery, as Paul says to the Colossians, hidden for ages and generations, but revealed to you, Christ in you, the hope of glory. And so there's so much there that you can go back and read, but I think these 3 things are what really stand out to me, especially as we're thinking about the resurrection of Jesus, that God's deliverance comes in surprising ways, but His deliverance comes. And His deliverance comes in such a way that it leads to His ultimate outcome and objective. And so we have great faith. All right, well, that's 1 Samuel 18 through 20. We'll look forward to picking up again in Samuel next week, and we'll dismiss from class from this point.